So welcome everybody. This is our 9th webinar and we're pleased to have Bob Beaton as our guest today. Bob and I have been colleagues for a long time, starting in DARPA back in the late 90s, where Bob was already well ahead of me from his DARPA days of building new capabilities for the military. So Bob, thank you for joining us, and let you expand on what I said about your background a little bit, and then we can get into a discussion about the technologies that you've been working on to help improve our DoD.
Sure, thanks, Marv. Yeah, well, let's see. I'm an aerospace control systems guy by education and background, and back in the 80s, when I first got out of school, that was the second wave of AI, and everything that was going on was automated vehicles and getting started in that area, and automated planning system, and there were lots of interesting things that DARPA was funding at the time, and so on. And so I kind of got pulled in that direction, and quickly got pulled out of the aerospace community into the bigger automation, AI, enterprise, command and control kinds of things, and sort of started going down that line. As you said, Marv, I got a chance to work at DARPA in the late 90s, which was a lot of fun, and we did some really interesting things. And since then, I've been consulting on my own, mostly for DoD and intelligence community customers in the government, but an occasional commercial venture here and there. And in the last couple of years, I've been spending most of my time supporting the Joint AI Center and doing some work with DISA, Emerging Technologies Group, as my primary activities.
Yeah, I remember, Bob, back when we were in that DARPA Information Systems Office division, that was when natural language processing was being developed by that organization to a significant extent, and also the automatic image recognition technologies were being developed. And then, of course, AI went quiescent, and nobody would say the word because it had sort of been overblown, I guess. And now we seem to be, as you said, in the second wave of AI that's now promising to do everything for the world. So let me just ask you, what technology do you see that are critical for going forward DoD, given the peer competitor structure we're dealing with today between China and Russia?
Well, I'll tell you, it's interesting. My view is that from what I've seen now in the last 3 or 4 years is that for DoD, technology is really not our problem. There is tons of technology out there. Commercial world's developing it like crazy in all sorts of different areas. And our big problem, I think, is going to be how to be able to digest it and bring it into our mission operational activities in light of all the very complex processes we have around security and acquisition and data sharing and all sorts of things that are just presenting really, really big obstacles to us being successful. And in my experience here working in probably the last 2 or 3 years, I would say security by far becomes the biggest challenge. We probably spend 80% of our time trying to work through all our security constraints and all of the processes and issues there. And to me, that's probably the biggest challenge of all, is how do we have a breakthrough in how we deal with security so that we can get some of the good stuff that's out there in place, let alone try to develop new stuff like DARPA is trying to do.
Yeah, an interesting story that goes back a long way. When I first met Jim Petrosini, he was the guy that introduced me to World Wide Web when I I just got into the DASN job in the mid 90s, and ever since. So of course now we're up into this business of cloud and trying to adopt commercial clouds into our warfighting military infrastructure. You might want to say a little more about that, Jim, but I think that's a significant change that's ongoing right now.
Yeah, so just back from the JADC2 conference down at Texas A&M, and it was the technical director from Google Federal that kind of said we need to change the way we have multiple classified networks, where we control our data by just putting them on different classifications of networks. And if you really want to have JADC2 reach across all the services, you've got to change that. And so I think that's, from a cyber point of view, I guess the question is, do you think the DoD will ever go to, one, or, reduce the number of different networks they have.
Wow. Well, we've been talking about trying to do that different ways for a lot of years, and still haven't seemed to make much progress. I don't have a good answer there. I think the technology's there if we have the will to do that. It's interesting. I was just talking to some folks a couple of days ago in this whole network area. I guess General Skinner at DISA has decided that the way we're dealing with all our network interconnections here at scale has become such a problem that he's starting a major new initiative called Thunderdome to try to kind of completely re-engineer the whole internet to government interconnections and how we start to do across a bunch of these networks. And we've got to do something on that scale, it seems to me, because we've got a really old and patchwork system that just has to be totally re-engineered. So hopefully we can do that. We'll see how that goes. But I'd like to add that it's interesting when it comes to data sharing, we're even having major challenges sharing data on the same network. We have lots and lots of organizations, let's say, that are working and with the guys I've been working with, mostly doing work at the unclassified level on NIPRNet. Just sharing data at the same classification level has been a nightmare, with all of the tendency to people wanting to not let their data go, to all the rules and policies they can point to for why they shouldn't share. And then even if they are willing to share, then we have our security authorizing officials who are reluctant to either let data out of their networks or accept somebody else's data into their networks, because maybe that'll cause a problem and somebody's going to get in trouble. So I don't know, we could do a lot of benefit if we could just figure out how to share data within a single classification, in my view, let alone the bigger problem of across. And I think you're absolutely right. I don't know how we're going to be successful in JADC2 if we don't, really figure this out.
Well, I actually like to pull that thread a little bit more, Jim and Bob, because I've thought for a long time that this 3 physical or multiple physical networks for security classification, that worked fine when perimeter was your only way that you try to mitigate the cybersecurity solution. But unfortunately, it minimizes your ability to share data, as we've been talking about. And these authorizing authorities can never get on the same page when you're trying to get an authorization to use multi-level security or multi-security domain, cross-domain devices, and et cetera, et cetera. So the net result is we're holding back the military capability. We're minimizing our ability to move forward in any kind of rapid way. And in the meantime, we have software-defined networking that allows us to break networks into thousands of networks and do all kinds of different things with them riding the same pipe, and we don't take advantage of it because we're locked into this archaic, historic reason for having the physical networks on everything we do. I think it's crazy.
Yeah, I think the conversation at the conference was, Netflix uses digital rights management, and then we have things like attribute-based control and role-based access control. So there's technologies out there that you can put everything on the same network, have one network, but you limit who can see it by other things other than physical separation, right? And that's a culture shock and an education level. And like Bob said, you have this legacy bureaucracy of processes. And I think the comment was from a senior person who worked in the Pentagon. He said, just to get JWICs in the Pentagon took me 2 years. So it's definitely an issue that'll be interesting to see if it maybe JADC2 becomes the effort that tries to fix this, but we'll see.
I actually don't think it will. I don't think JADC2 is trying to really fix it. Nobody tries to go back to that base layer problem and foundational problem and fix it. And the problem, as you just stated, is the productivity is just completely down the drain for anything we try to do, whether it's just getting a drop or whether it's operating on the systems to make something happen for the mission activities. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say the one area where I could see some hope right now is in the commercial cloud environment. The big providers, and I won't get into specific providers by name, but for the most part, they are putting data on the same physical network, and they're limiting access to it through software controls of various kinds, right? Some more, deeper than others. And if you go to one of those cloud providers now and you can't you really can't get a physically separate network for your data. You have to live with their software separations, and they're very secure, and they've put a lot of effort into it, and they're very strong. And it's, it really comes down to what people are used to, and you've got folks who just are used to and comfortable with physical separation, and they just don't want to reconsider. But as that becomes more and more ubiquitous, both in the commercial world and as we start to bring clouds into more and more into the government world, I think that's going to change. It's just unfortunately changing a lot slower than we need it to change.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like Amazon doesn't have a physical JWIX cloud and a physical SIPRNet cloud and a physical CWAN and a physical, they use software technology to do the separation, right? And you've got your different DoD impact levels on the same physical cloud and hardware. So that might be a great way to maybe get some interest.
Yeah, it should get better over time. But again, will we get better fast enough? We got other adversaries that aren't being as tentative and slow as we are, and that's not good.
So let's move over to AI for a minute, Bob. How do you see AI playing in the future of the DoD, and what from your vantage point, what do you see happening?
Wow, I mean, that's really hard to say, right? I mean, it's obviously an incredibly high priority, and it's got people's attention, and it's got people running scared, not just at the DoD level, but from an overall national competitiveness perspective, right? You have political leadership thinking we're in this big, existential fight for the AI high ground with other countries. So it's certainly got a lot of attention and a lot of resources. I do worry a bit that it's, we may see another wave like we've done in the past where it gets so overhyped and people, it comes back to reality a little bit. But, but there are some really big breakthroughs here in this third wave that we're in relative before, largely driven by what we didn't have in the first and second wave, which was really cheap, massive computing at scale through the cloud, and then massive, massive data storage. And I think that's probably been the key, right? Is we now can get big enough data sets and process them at scale that we can start to find and do things with deep learning and things that we just didn't have the horsepower. So that's really the big change, and it's having really meaningful impact. And you can see the commercial guys are making huge investments in the attempt to keep up. So I think it's here to stay. I think the challenge for the DoD, again, as I've said, is less a technology one and more of a cultural business process reengineering. And can we change the way we operate to account for the way you've got to do AI? I Marv, we've talked about this. There are a lot of really good of the most advanced AI enabled organizations. They really make the case that you have to make an organizational level philosophical change to be successful in AI. It's not a little glue on, add this on to your current process. You really got to really think about changing the whole way you think about things and to be successful. And that's, I think, going to be the bigger challenge for the department, right? We know how hard it is to change the culture, to change processes and change mindsets. And can we do that? It's going to be a real big challenge for us.
What I think is interesting is that unlike the days when we were in the middle of this business, we now have a whole hardware layer that's radically changing. So we have tensor processing units, neural processing units, GDPs, CPUs. So we are causing the hardware solutions to overwhelm some of the complexities along with those large data sets that you're talking about. And one thing that I've thought about a lot is I think that in the DoD side, we tend to be thinking about AI to solve problems that it's really not ready to solve. For instance, command and control problems, because you need to have explainable AI that helps the commanders understand why the machine is recommending what it's recommending before he's going to try and do that and put it into the battlefield, the real-time activities that are going on. But the other thing that AI is really good at is it could easily be a AI model that's taking information straight off sensors and pulling out the exact right information and parsing it to the right places much faster than we could do it any other way. And it could also eliminate the amount of data that we have to move around from our mobile platforms like ships and airplanes, et cetera. And then the other, I had this experience recently. Somebody mentioned to me that I ought to put a written transcription of these webinars onto the site. So I looked around how to do that, found a new commercial business web page but for a very reasonable price, was able to take my audio files and transcribe them into written files, and they come out phenomenally good. And they even identify which speakers are speaking. I just have to go in and edit the name of the speakers because they call it speaker 1, 2, and 3. So I knew immediately that they were using an AI capability to translate these kinds of verbal discussions into written language that's so perfect.
Yeah, I know like some of the early, I would say probably machine learning is catching on a little bit more, where I do think DoD folks are starting to see that, like reading logs, after the SolarWinds incident, like computers can read logs better than humans. And from a cyber point of view, like, the old days, we'd have 50 people sitting at a SOC pretending to look at monitors. And so I think anomaly detection is going to be the first place. And, Intel analysts are starting to see that computers can do some of the mundane stuff better, but we still have a long ways to go, I think.
I think you're right on, Jim, that's a really great area, right? One, there is tremendous amounts of data in the cyberspace that's generated all the time. And it's too fast and too painful to have all but the super savant people. There are some people who can read it, like the code in the Matrix, and it's just almost intuitive. But for 99.9% of us, it's a real drudgery thing. And there's some really, good opportunities there. I know one of the things I'm doing with DISA right now, which is kind of interesting, they just are bringing on board what they call a cyber asset inventory management commercial tool from a small company that's going to generate a tremendous amount of information on over 100,000 devices on the JSP network. But then the next question is, okay, great, you got all this data. How in the hell are you going to possibly figure out what's going on at the right speed without some sort of AI type of help? And I think in what I've seen, Marv, we talked about this, we seem to be really good in DoD about buying more and more sensors to produce more and more information, but we aren't so good about spending money on the things that make sense of that information and turn it into something useful. Well, remember one of the classic cases, it's not a direct AI effort, but Marv and I remember we were working the thing with the Navy and all the money they were spending on P-8s and the Tritons, right? Hundreds of, billions really of dollars on these aircraft, and you couldn't get them to spend any money on the talks that would collect and store and process the data, relatively speaking. So how do we balance that out is going to be a big challenge. But I know the cyber area is a great area, probably one of the best, and also another existential problem for us right now, right? With all the businesses getting ransomware attacked all over the place. So I definitely like to see some work and focus in that area.
It's a good point you brought up, Bob. I hadn't thought about it for a while, but you're referring to the data study we did on how much ISR data is going to be available for the Navy.
Yeah.
And we did this back in the 14 timeframe, if I remember right. And we determined from all of the meetings and reviews we held that the Navy was going to be producing a petabyte of data per day by 2018. So obviously we're producing that much and more. And as you point out, we don't have enough capacity on the ground sites to bring all the data down and store it or do anything with it more than throw it away if they didn't get something off of it in real time. And that goes back to my point about we really could use much more effectively the AI tools that could be applied to that streaming data coming off those sensors. But here's an interesting thing about cybersecurity. The Navy just ran 3 AI cybersecurity challenges. So they ran a cybersecurity challenge that said, which company has a product that can help protect my endpoints with AI? Then they went on to say which companies and technologies could protect my network. And now they're finalizing one on which AI can protect the SOC. And the interesting thing about the awards and the findings that they've done so far is the AI systems that have been brought in and compared and ran and been awarded the award. They're not doing any better than the non-AI capabilities for that kind of cyber detection of malware. So we'll see. I'm sure it'll get better over time.
Yeah. Then another area is there's all this data, but there's a new buzzword in the commercial world called index lifecycle management, where, out of all the data that you collect, what's hot, what's warm, what's cold, and even what's frozen, like how much data do you really need to keep and analyze? Because most of the commercial companies are dividing up the information into segments, right? And if I only need to look at logs for the first couple of days, and after they're 5 days old, I just archive them. And so that's a challenge to get the government to kind of, when you ask them how much data do you collect, first of all, they sometimes don't even know how much data they collect. And then they don't know how much is hot, warm, and cold. So they can't get any kind of cost analysis. And there's a view at the JADC conference that like to collect all the data, the government can't afford it. If they want to use commercial tools. So it'll be interesting how that evolves.
Well, one of the things I think is an interesting area, Marv, I wanted to throw out there while I'm thinking about it is, we're going to leverage commercial tools, and there's lots going on in the commercial space to improve, DoD business practices and things that, sort of line up with the commercial world. But we do have some really interesting, unique problems as, as we get out into the tactical, warfighting domains at the edge. And, one of the things that's been going on is there's been this big push the last couple of years while I've been working with this mindset for a lot of the folks coming in doing AI, that we're going to bring all the data back to the central cloud and crunch away and do great AI there, and then push out AI models. And we've been really trying to convince folks that there's going to be a lot of data out at the edge that can't come back. We don't have the tactical networks, or they're being used for more higher priority things. And we've got to figure out a paradigm that may be different from commercial, where we can push out the AI, what I call the AI workload, out to the data, and figure out to do AI in a much more distributed way, where it's not just all about moving data around, but the right combination. Sometimes maybe you move data to the compute. Sometimes you might move the AI training workload to the data, and figure out how you make that all work. And that's not something that's as high a priority for most of the commercial world. So that's something that maybe the DoD can be focusing on some of those areas.
Yeah, Bob, my last previous company, we used to say, send the question out to the data and get the answer back. You don't need to send the data back to get the question and answer done. And the question and answer are lower size files.
Yes,
you can send, but that culture that you're going to have nodes out at the edge, and then you have things like cross-cluster search and cross-cluster replication, is a commercial concept that the government still have this mindset, send all the data back to the Intel center. So that, again, culturally, it's new stuff that they have to get educated on. So we'll see how that happens.
Part of the challenge, I think, is a security driven model, right? So we actually have a guy here who just brought on board the Jake, who had been doing a lot of work with Tesla. Marv and I talked to him about, and he's talked about how companies like Tesla are pushing AI workload, in their case, out to the cars, right? The data's at the car, millions of cars. You don't want to bring data back from millions of cars, but you can send some AI training out. And what you have to do is you can't train one model on one car. You've got to train on lots of cars and then figure out how to aggregate the results into sort of the best model. So there are some challenges, but the nice thing that they have is that they have a security model where they allow themselves to do training on an operational system, their equivalent of the tactical environment. Our security rules do not allow for us to do any sort of development or training activity on a production or tactical system, right? That's against the rules. And they were put in place for good reasons at the time. But now, as we get to a world where to take advantage of AI and to move quickly enough, you've got to be able to start to blur that distinction between a production environment and a development environment. And you have to allow development to happen in production environments and real production data to be available in development environments. We're breaking our security paradigm rules. And if we don't fix that and solve that, we're really going to limit our ability to be a leader in AI in the DoD.
Yeah, we're doing DevSecOps, but right now the ops is still separate. But I think part of DevSecOps is supposed to be continuous monitoring, right? And then you continuously update the software. And they've done some demos with like Joint Strike Fighter, but again, it's still a mindset or an education that you are going to update that operational system in real time. So again,
it's a critically good point, Bob, but I'm actually in this particular area a little bit more optimistic because of the work on virtual twins. So as you know, the Aegis system is working on a virtual twin, and the idea is that they preload all the new software onto the twin, which is plugged into the accesses of all the sensors and controllers that they're trying to control with the software, and it can test it there before it's moved in and used as the uploaded software version for the operational software that runs the ship or runs the combat system. And that's not unlike what Tesla does. So when Tesla does, they call it a shadow compute system or shadow image. So the shadow is actually learning and trying to improve the AI while the operational system is using supporting the car to do self-driving or cruise control, whatever they're trying to do. And the interesting things that they're also doing about it, which points to your earlier discussion or Jim's discussion about hot, warm, and cold data. What they care about for the full self-driving, which is camera driven only right now, is they care about the outlier points. They care about the points when what the car already knows with its training algorithms is a new thing to it that it doesn't get quite right. So the shadow computer is really looking for the outlier things that are where the car is doing something different than they would have expected it would do or should do. So I think we could do the same thing with our virtual twin kinds of things as we train systems. But what hasn't gone on is everybody doesn't think about having a virtual twin architecture. It's in the Aegis combat system right now. It's not in the airplanes right now. It's not in the command and control systems right now. But with the compute capacity we have today, there's no reason not to have a virtual image all the time.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, Marv. It's certainly doable, and I'm familiar. You've been briefing me on that in the past, and that's really exciting. But I would say that's the rare exception right now, than the rule. So we got to start to educate people that that's feasible to do. But yeah, absolutely, that's the way to go.
So I have a question for both of you, just because you two are very, very smart with your backgrounds. General John Murray, who's the 4-star Army Futures Command, they're planning to bring in software developers into the active duty Army over the next 5 years, because their mindset is we have to have a developer and a coder at the edge. We can't, systems are going to change so fast that we can't rely on, contractors or even the labs to do, monthly or 6-month updates. They got to be fixed, in real time. So he came with a strategy to acquire these developers and recruit them and bring them on. But then a lot of people in the audience said, well, how are you going to retain them? So I was just wondering your thoughts on, where do you see that going in the next, 20 years? The
whole talent area, and how does the government and the military get the right talent in? That's a huge challenge. There, the National Security Council AI group that's been chartered has put a lot of effort into looking at that problem, not just from a DoD perspective, but from a national perspective as well. And it's a tough nut. There's a lot of interesting things we can try. I think we're going to have to be experimental. Some of the ideas I've thought were interesting is I've had a chance to work recently with a lot of the AI activities. It's most of the combat commands with some of the groups that I've been running for the JAIC. And where I see them doing the best work is they have military officers that have the military experience, that have retired and gotten interested in data science or AI and gone back and gotten those degrees. Some started them while they were still in active duty, but a lot of them actually went out after they retired and did that. And they've come back as sort of military savvy data scientists or AI people. And they can actually now have both the domain knowledge and the AI data science knowledge to do essentially real-time work for the combatant commands, or in some cases further down the chain. And that's where I see by far the most successful progress. Now, these are little islands kind of scattered about, right? That they've kind of done this on their own, but maybe there's a way that we could do that. Maybe there could be some programs where retiring people could go in and the government might help them with the degree and bring them back for, some period of time if they're interested in getting into that field. The other thing I've always kind of been scratching my head with is how do you get the really superstar talent to come into this, especially now with industry throwing so much money at people, right? There's no way the government can compete on salary with, startup money and stock and all that's going on. But the one area that I kind of find is interesting, in my older son's fall of law is that right now, the very, very best law talent in the world coming out of the very best law schools, they fall over themselves trying to get the lowest paying job you can coming out of school, which is to be a clerk for a federal judge or a Supreme Court judge and make $30,000 a year for 1 or 2 or 3 years. And the reason they do that is because that has been made into such a prestigious position that they'll do anything to get that. And I'm just wondering if there's a way we could somehow have very prestigious opportunities for the best AI talent coming out of school to maybe come into these jobs, not permanently, they're not going to stay for forever, but something like that to combat the pure financial perspective. I don't know, there's probably a lot of other good ideas, but I think we're going to have to really think creatively if we're going to attract that kind of talent in there. The last thing I would say there too, and I've talked, it was interesting, my younger son's a software guy, and he was, graduated recently. I think I mentioned this to Marv, and was actually interested in looking at getting into government service, working some software kinds of things. And he ended up pursuing at the job fairs when everyone came in. He was a Georgia Tech guy. Talked to commercial guys, talked to government guys from several of the organizations. And the commercial guys were getting back to him in a week or two with, come out and visit us, or with offers. The government took 6 to 8 months. In some cases, he got an actual call from a government organization over 12 months later, after he had selected a job, moved to another state, got an apartment, and had been working for 6 months. And then for the first time, he heard back from this government organization. Now, maybe this isn't typical. I hope it's not. But my sense is the government has to move at the pace of its commercial competitors, or at least be close, because these kids aren't going to wait around for 6 or 12 months because the government's waiting for a rec to open. If you want to go get talent, do what commercial guys do. Have a way to go get talent and bring them in, and then figure out where to put them. Don't sit around for 2 years and waiting for some guy to have a rec before you go get a guy. It's too late.
And this is a great discussion, Bob and Jim. But Jim, you know well that the INRI system, as you worked on, and Admiral Tuttle, who was the operational fleet commander, that was an example that worked very, very well of what you're talking about. But it was done with industry folks writing ships, writing code during their waking hours on the ship to increase the command and control capability. And of course, we're still living with the basis of that technology today. So rather than what the Army is trying to do, I agree with Bob. We're probably better off if we bring in the experts from one form or another, where you can let industry pay for them and you don't have to worry about the government salaries. And it could be very prestigious for an industry guy to go get a position where he's working on something as critical as that, and applying leading edge technology to the front lines. And that would help his career as well as help the government in a different way.
Yeah, I think there's some, we do some work at Space Camp, and, there's some interesting things like Air Force has done with Kessel Run and Space Camp that, I just was out at Space Camp 2 weeks ago, and like the Air Force captain wears, khakis and t-shirt and a ball cap. And, they're in a WeWork like facility, and, and I don't know, Marv, I was throwing out the idea, like, do we see bonuses like we saw in the nuclear power world, where not a huge amount of money, but enough money to separate them from, they were specialized, right? If you were a nuke, you got your extra 50, 60K after 5 years, and that was enough to retain. My brother-in-law is a Cobra pilot. He got a 65K bonus, and that's what retained him to 20 years.
No, I think you're making good points. So we've actually gone probably 30 minutes, maybe a little bit over. This is a sort of a wrap-up discussion. Bob, I wanted you to just comment on what your perspective is on the China AI race. You already mentioned it once, but where do you think that's going to take us over the next 5, 10, 15 years?
Well, 15 years is tough. Let me start with 5, maybe I can handle that. I mean, clearly it's the next 5 years, this is going to be a big push on both sides. And I think that the wave of momentum behind us will carry this along for at least 5 years, right? I mean, with the budgets, the way government budgets and so on. That alone is going to carry us forward.
Yeah, good point.
So and we'll see. What we see in the past, right? Is after, it's one thing to go the first 2 or 3 years on sheer panic, but at some point people are going to want to start to see things paying off and some progress happening. And I think we get to the 5 or 6 year point, if we're not showing real progress, then like the second wave and the first wave, there might be some ratcheting back in terms of how much we're spending here. And so we'll see. It's hard to predict. Again, I think unfortunately for us, it's not so much a technology issue. It is a cultural change and process improvement. There's lots of things we could be doing right now quite quickly that I see stifled and impeded just purely by the bureaucratic obstacles in front of us. And that's what we're going to have to change. And Jim, you mentioned the Kessel Run and the Air Force Space Camp and the thing. And one thing I will say is with the Jake folks I'm working with, they have they understand that goodness of the Air Force work in there, and we've partnered very carefully, very closely with them, and are trying to look at some of the DevSecOps automation and how do we extend it to the full AI lifecycle. And there's a very strong partnership there with the Air Force. So, there's some, I think people are looking at the right things, but we still have a long way to go with respect to the security processes and so on that, keep us from getting all the way there. I'd like to actually see, I was thinking about this, I'd like to see us somehow have a multi-service, multi-policy, technical, some sort of real focused effort at a very high level in DoD to go to essentially build a new security approach for AI for the department. That's not pressured by immediate need to deliver a specific product. Because what I see happening a lot is people who are charged to build a capability will be at the same time trying to reinvent a new process that they need to be successful, while they're also trying to build the mission AI capability that they're being asked to build. And those are too much. And what happens is their process re-engineering falls by the wayside at some point while you seek to make progress on your mission AI application. So if we could get the real team of real empowered people to sort of essentially what comes after RMF, the risk management framework, what's that got to look like, and how does it have to work for AI, and do that for the department as a whole and really crack that nut. That would be, I think, the biggest thing that we could do that would benefit everyone across all the services, combatant commands, the whole 9 yards. So that's what I'd leave you with, a push for. Who do we go see to make that happen?
That's an excellent point. And while you're talking about that, we didn't mention that AI opens up the whole new security or cybersecurity domain of AI spoofing, which is way different than just normal cybersecurity. So thank you again for being here. Jim, did you want to say the last words?
No, I just thought maybe you just maybe say something about Admiral Clemens, and maybe we honor this podcast for him. So
it's a great idea. I was telling these folks before we started the recording that I attended Admiral Clemens' funeral this morning. In fact, I'll post the memoriam that was created by his wife for him. It's a very strong tearjerker that represents his 34 years in the Navy, and fortunately he's followed by his son, who's in the Navy still as a Navy commander, and he's got 4 beautiful grandchildren, and his wife still lives in Boise. But he was a great man, and he died at the age of 77, well before his time. So I'll put that memoriam up. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Bob. So
Thank
we'll
you.
check out.